Joyce Meyer has built a billion-dollar empire, telling millions of people how to heal from their past. She's written over 100 books. She fills arenas. She broadcasts to billions across the globe. And the foundation of her entire message, the story she's told thousands of times, is the abuse she suffered at the hands of her own father. But here's what rarely gets discussed. The woman who teaches the world about forgiveness and family restoration has a complicated relationship with her own children. The woman who preaches about breaking generational curses has family members who've quietly stepped away from her ministry. And the woman who built her brand on overcoming a traumatic childhood has a family history that raises more questions than her sermons answer. So what really happened inside the Meyer family? And why don't we ever hear from the people closest to her? To understand Joyce Meyer, you have to start in Fenton, Missouri in the 1940s. Joyce was born Pauline Joyce Hutchison in 1943. And from the earliest age, her home was a nightmare. Her father was a World War II veteran who came back from the war a different man. According to Joyce's own testimony, which she shared publicly for decades, her father began sexually abusing her when she was just a young child. The abuse continued for years. She's described being raped repeatedly, being threatened, being told that if she ever told anyone, terrible things would happen. Her mother knew. Joyce has said this publicly. Her mother was aware of what was happening, but felt powerless to stop it. This detail matters because it sets up a pattern that would repeat itself throughout Joyce's life. The people closest to the abuse, the people who should have protected her, either couldn't or wouldn't act. By the time Joyce was a teenager, she was desperate to escape. At 18, she married a part-time car salesman. The marriage lasted 5 years and produced one son, David. But Joyce has described this first marriage as another form of captivity. She said her first husband was unfaithful, that he convinced her to commit petty crimes, that she was trading one form of dysfunction for another. In 1967, Joyce married Dave Meyer, an engineering draftsman she met at a company where she worked. This is the marriage that would last. This is the man who would eventually become the co-founder of Joyce Meyer Ministries. And this is where the public story begins. But there's a gap in the narrative that Joyce rarely addresses in detail. Her son, David, from her first marriage, grew up in a complicated household. He was the child of a traumatic first union, raised by a stepfather, while his mother was battling what she's described as years of emotional dysfunction, anger, and spiritual searching. Joyce and Dave Meyer went on to have 3 more children together: Laura, Sandra, and Daniel. 4 children total. And as Joyce Meyer Ministries grew from a small Bible study in the 1970s to a global media empire by the 1990s, these children grew up in the shadow of something massive. Now here's where things get interesting. All 4 of Joyce Meyer's children have, at various points, worked for the ministry. David Meyer served on the board of directors, and Laura Holtzman and Sandra McCollum have both held positions within the organization. Daniel Meyer has been involved in ministry operations. On the surface, this looks like a family business success story. 4 children, all working alongside their mother, all part of the mission. But when you dig deeper, the picture becomes more complicated. In 2009, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch published an investigation into Joyce Meyer Ministries. The report revealed that Joyce Meyer's children and their spouses were receiving substantial salaries from the nonprofit ministry. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars. The ministry defended these payments as appropriate compensation for legitimate work. But the optics raised eyebrows. Here's the tension. Joyce Meyer preaches about sacrifice. She talks about laying down worldly comforts for spiritual purposes. Yet, her family members were drawing significant income from donations that came from everyday people, many of whom were struggling financially themselves. The documented facts show family members being compensated generously from ministry funds, while Joyce preached about trusting God with your finances. But the money isn't even the most interesting part. What's notable is how rarely Joyce Meyer's children speak publicly about their mother, about their childhoods, about what it was like growing up as the sons and daughters of a woman processing severe trauma while simultaneously building a religious empire. Joyce has been remarkably transparent about her father's abuse. She's written entire books about it. She's shared graphic details from stages in front of thousands of people. But her children's perspectives on their own upbringing remain largely absent from the public record. This raises a question. When your mother's entire brand is built on her painful family history, what does that do to you as a child? When millions of strangers know intimate details about your grandfather's crimes, details that are part of your own family legacy, how do you process that? Joyce Meyer has spoken about struggling with anger for years after her abuse. She's talked about being difficult to live with. She's described herself as controlling and harsh during her early years of marriage and motherhood. These aren't accusations. These are things she's admitted publicly as part of her testimony. But the children who lived through that period, the children who experienced whatever version of Joyce existed before she became the polished television preacher, they've remained largely silent. There's also the matter of Joyce's father. In one of the most dramatic moments of her public ministry, Joyce Meyer announced that she had forgiven her father for the abuse. She's described visiting him later in his life, praying with him, and ultimately believing that he repented before his death. It's a compelling story. It's the kind of story that makes for incredible television, but it also raises complicated questions for the rest of the family. Did Joyce's mother ever fully reckon with her failure to protect her daughter? Did Joyce's children ever meet their grandfather, the man who committed these documented crimes? How did the family process Joyce's very public forgiveness of a man who caused so much private pain? These questions don't have public answers, and that silence is itself revealing. What we can document is this. Joyce Meyer Ministries became one of the largest Christian ministries in the United States. At its peak, the ministry was bringing in over $100 million annually. Joyce Meyer purchased a private jet. She acquired multiple homes, including a 10,000-square-foot residence and several properties for her children. In 2009, Joyce Meyer Ministries joined the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability after years of operating without external oversight. This came after Senator Chuck Grassley launched an investigation into several televangelists, including Joyce Meyer, regarding their financial practices. The ministry made changes. They became more transparent about executive compensation, but the fundamental structure remained. A family-controlled religious organization, funded by donations from believers, providing substantial resources to the Meyer family. None of this is necessarily illegal. Religious organizations in America have broad latitude in how they operate. But the documented reality stands in tension with the message of sacrifice and humility that Joyce preaches. And what about the children today? David Meyer, Joyce's oldest son from her first marriage, has maintained the lowest profile of all the Meyer children. He's served in ministry roles, but rarely appears in public alongside his mother. The child who came from Joyce's most traumatic period, the son she was raising while still processing her own abuse, he remains largely invisible in the ministry's public presence. Laura, Sandra, and Daniel have been more visibly involved. But even their involvement has evolved over the years. Some have stepped back from day-to-day operations. Some have focused on their own families, rather than the ministry machine. The pattern that emerges is one of gradual distance, not dramatic public breaks, not tell-all interviews, just a quiet retreat from the spotlight that their mother occupies so completely. And maybe that's the most human part of this entire story. Joyce Meyer built her empire on exposing her family's darkest secrets. She made her father's crimes part of her brand. She turned her trauma into content. And in doing so, she created something that her own children can never fully escape, but also can never fully control. The documented facts show a ministry worth hundreds of millions of dollars, controlled by one woman's narrative, funded by people who believe in her story. The same documented facts show family members who've benefited financially from that narrative, but rarely contribute their own perspectives to it. Joyce Meyer is now in her 80s. The question of what happens to the ministry after her is one that the organization has addressed only vaguely. Will her children take over? Will the empire that was built on one woman's personal testimony survive without that woman at the center? What we know is this: Joyce Meyer's entire public identity is built on overcoming a broken family. She preaches about restoration and healing and forgiveness. Millions of people have been moved by her story of transforming pain into purpose. But her own family remains largely silent. Her own children have never publicly shared what it was like to be raised by a woman working through severe trauma while simultaneously becoming one of the most famous preachers in America. The people who know Joyce Meyer most intimately have chosen not to tell their stories. And in a ministry built entirely on one family's story, that silence speaks volumes. Maybe the Meyer children have found peace with their mother and their unusual upbringing. Maybe they're simply private people who don't want public attention. Or maybe the reality of growing up inside that family is more complicated than any sermon could capture. The woman who tells millions of people how to heal their families has a family that we know almost nothing about. The woman who preaches transparency about trauma has children who've remained remarkably opaque. The woman who built her brand on one generation's sins has never publicly addressed what kind of generational patterns she may have passed down. These aren't accusations. These are observations based on what's documented and what's absent. Joyce Meyer has earned hundreds of millions of dollars teaching people about family healing. But the full story of her own family, the parts her children might tell, remains untold. And that's probably not an accident.